I'm Marcel, and welcome to me screaming into the void, mostly about books. I have a project where I read one book from each country of the world, and now it comes to Nauru. There are two very well-known books from Nauru, which are both fairy tales, and I absolutely have them on my wishing list, but both of these books are not in print anymore and therefore extremely difficult to get a copy on. What I do have is a book of collections of authors from different Micronesian states. So you have Guam, Kiribati, and Nauru. So for Nauru, I'm going to read the 4 texts in this book that are written by Nauru authors. The 4 texts are organized in theme, like all of them. So you have, and one of the texts, I want to repeat data, is with under the theme of resistance, and the 3 other texts are under remembering. So I'm going to read those. They are very short. They're like 2, 3, 4 pages each, but they're 4 different voices, 4 different authors. So that will be an interesting experience to do it that way. So I'll let you know how it goes on. So I've read 2 of the texts, and I need to talk. The first one was fascinating. I read that before I learned anything about Nauru history, and it's by Ruby Dedia, and about Nauru in 2001. So it was written in 1990, and she is imagining Nauru 10 years further in time. And this is a very ecological text. She is imagining herself as a bird, and she is traveling around the island and talking about how desolated it's become, how it's the nature is replaced by buildings and electric poles. And she talks about how there are how her parents are leaving the town. So it's a very depressing text in one sense. There is very little hope in it. So yet there is a very clear focus that she is sort of talking about the past, which is very nature themed. She's talking about being connected to a nature that has now become lost in the year 2001. And that is in and of itself not necessarily a new theme. I know that a lot of authors from countries that have a very history with being related to nature talks about modernity, and very often in a negative light. So I wasn't really surprised by that. It's a very well written text in regard to the focus of the theme of the ecology and how we are all connected in and of itself. And then I read the next text. The next text is titled Nauru Women Picket a Government-Sponsored Flight to London for the stage play Leonardo da Vinci, May 27th, 1993. The opening of the text starts like this. On that day, we women of Nauru made a stand. That morning we voiced our dissatisfaction at the government's continued misuses of our people's money on poor investments, in particular Duke Minx's stage play called Leonardo da Vinci. We women picketed the flight taken taking the VIPs to Melbourne and thence to London to attend the inaugural opening of a government-financed play. This is our unforgettable story of we women who organised and took part in an effort to stop the plane from taking off from Nauru Airport. As someone who doesn't really know anything about Nauru, my first question was, what kind of text is this? So I had to Google Nauru history, and that's a very weird history from an economic point of view. Nauru is a tiny island with about 11,000 inhabitants and became insanely rich in the 60s and 70s thanks to phosphate, which is a mineral that had happened due to bird droppings, fossilited bird droppings. And the fact about this phosphate is mentioned in the first text, but I didn't think about it. But when I then started reading about Nauru's economic history, I understood the first text so much better, in addition to understanding the second text, because while this island became insanely rich due to mismanagement and corruption, they lost a lot of the money in the 80s and especially during the 90s when both of these texts were written. And then they were members of a bank in Australia where this Duke Minx was a member as a financial advisor. And he was then Nauru's financial advisor, and he advised them to be a producer and give him money for a play he had written, which is then Leonardo da Vinci. So the text that this text about Nauru's women's picket, a government-sponsored flight, is something that actually happened because the people of Nauru was just sick of the mismanagement of people's money, especially when they were now been taken advantage of by Duke Minsk. And it's so sad to see how Nauru's government historically clearly had no idea how to invest that money into their own economy. And I'm not saying that as just sort of, oh, poor person in this island. That is also what Maria Gayabu is writing about in her text, about the anger that she feels that her island that is now depleted, the island and nature that they have sacrificed, especially, and she talks about this sacrifice as something women did for their children. So she's connecting this sacrifice up to motherhood and the next generation. They did this all for the next generation that now has nothing. And how sort of the stage play, Leonardo da Vinci, was clearly just the final straw for them. And understanding that kind of sort of history puts, again, the other text, the ecological, our island is ruined, into sort of a more cohesive historical understanding. And it's just sad. And I know that when I sort of had read up on this, there is a form of sensationalism which links a lot of the mismanagement purely to this musical. I don't think that is possible. I don't think that it's purely the musical's fault that Nauru now is broke as a country, despite them being one of the richest countries in the 60s and 70s. But I think there is something very sort of sensational about it. And I think what she writes about is how this was sort of the thing that broke the camel's back, the straw that broke the camel. Seeing sort of both the first text as a sort of ecological response to the devastation that Nauru was in the 1990s when they were broke, and all of that wealth just withered away. In this text, Nauru's women picket a government-sponsored flight to London for the stage play Leonardo da Vinci, May 27th, 1993, is more a feministic text and response to it. So they're talking about the same thing, but they're putting different contexts in it and using it from, and Maria Goibu is very clearly talking about it from a feministic point of view, linking it up to motherhood. And she has an interesting comparison with what are these stupid women doing here at this early hour when they should be at home with their husbands and getting the children ready for school. This is something that the male policemen are thinking when these women are picketing. And the women's response to that is, it is the women who bear the children. We will continue the clans and expand to 12 tribes of Nauru. So the second text is just an essay almost about where she talks about this action, and that did happen. So when they were sort of going to ride off in their plane to watch this play that they had given all their money to because they were fooled by their financial advisor, and I can't believe he got away with that. The people actually stormed the airport and just hanged on the airplane, trying to get the government to not fly away to London. Talk about desperation. So that's the two first texts. I'm very, very glad that the second text was so detailed in its title that I had to figure out and read just what is going on, because the third text is also written in the 90s. The fourth text is written in the early 2000s. So three of them is in the same decade and talking about in the same situation. So having that in the back of my head, I probably am going to get more out of the two next texts. Hopefully, I'll see you later and say if I get something more out of it. So I've now read the last two texts. The first, or the third one, is a text called Egada by Lucia Itzamarer, and it's a fairy tale retelling about the things that I've already talked about with phosphate and the country sort of selling the earth and their country to get rich, and then what do they then spend the money on, and losing their old culture in the way. And the fourth text is a biographical text about the first female MP in Nauru by Alamanda Nauti. And the first woman was actually Ruby Daida, which is actually the author of the first text that we read. That I didn't think about that when I read the text. I just was going to present it and then said, oh, that sounds familiar. Yeah, I just read text from her. So that's fun. And so now I read 4 very short texts from 4 very different voices in and of itself. And what I see is that there are sort of 2 themes that are clearly emerging. One that is in center of all of the text from the 1990s, so the first 3 texts are talking about the economic situation in Nauru and the money and having to sacrifice their island to get this money that by the 1990s hasn't really given them anything. On the contrary, they feel that they are drawn to they've lost their old culture, they've lost their ability to live their old culture. The mining for phosphate meant that the country now doesn't have an ability to actually feed themselves. The natural resources are so depleted. They are completely dependent. Even if they didn't have money problems, they are completely dependent on outside forces, especially Australia. And the other theme that I sort of see, especially with the women that are hijacking the plane and the first woman in Parliament, is the theme of women's rights and how Nauru is a very old-fashioned place and how women are desperately trying to give themselves a space to be political active. And I don't think that it is surprising that the 2 texts that are specifically talking about women's issues are both political texts. They're talking about a political riot that the women led, and they're talking about the first prime minister. I don't think she was prime minister. I just think, yeah, she was just MP. She was just a member of parliament. Very fascinating texts. There are a lot more texts that I'm probably going to read further on. I can absolutely recommend this book, Indigenous Literatures from Micronesia. And it gave me more than necessarily a literary introduction to Nauru. It gave me an introduction to how, in different ways, in sort of 2 of them in fairy tale form, 1 of them in an essay, and 1 of them in a biographical form, different literary genres can be used to discuss both the different but also same political or social issues in a country. So thank you. I'm not going to ask you if you've read any of these texts, but if you've read anything, by all means, that's interesting. But I also really want to hear what you think about how you can use literature, and especially when it comes to texts that we don't necessarily think of as political texts. 2 of these texts that I talk about, both the one Nauru in 2001 by Ruby Dieda and Egada by Lucia Itsamara, have both a fairy tale sort of feel to it. They're telling a fairy tale. The genre is very clearly fairy tale, even if it's not folk fairy tale. How do you think about that kind of genre used to comment on political and social issues? Do you have any other good examples of that in other contexts? That would be very, very interesting to know, because I did study cultural history and I love fairy tales as a genre, and trying to figure out in what way the fairy tales are actually a comment on the society when it was sort of developed and created. So if you have any good examples of that in the comment, that would be very interesting to know. And other than that, thank you for listening to me screaming into the void.